If you stand in the heart of Bulgaria, in the valley where the Maritsa River drifts quietly by, you'll see 7 hills rising like islands of memory. Upon them rest red-tiled roofs, church towers, pale stones turned amber by the sun, and narrow streets that wind like veins through a living body. The people call this place Plovdiv, the city beneath time, but in truth, it's more than a city. It's a scroll of 8,000 years of human memory, where every layer of earth is another page in an unfinished story. Plovdiv has witnessed everything humanity can imagine: the first tribes kindling fires by the river, the kings who laid the first bricks of civilization, the armies that stormed through and vanished, the empires that rose and fell. Each century left a breath, a stone, a bridge, and the city never erased them. It kept them one atop another like a silent guardian of memory. Beneath Plovdiv lies another world: ancient Roman streets, the theater of Philippopolis, Thracian temples, Byzantine baths, Ottoman arches. Here, time doesn't flow. It settles layer by layer, century upon century, like sand covering memory. When you turn a corner, you might be walking on the roof of a 2,000-year-old road. When you sip coffee in a sunlit square, beneath your feet could be a stage where thousands once cheered under torchlight. But Plovdiv isn't just the story of stone. It's the story of people, those who lived, loved, fought, and believed amid the endless current of history. From Thracians carving signs into rock, to Romans raising columns, to Ottoman merchants weaving silk beneath market domes, all became part of the same enduring soul. A soul never conquered, only transformed to survive. And perhaps what makes Plovdiv unlike any other ancient city on earth is that it's still alive, not in museums, not trapped behind glass or tourist memory, but in the homes still lived in the laughter of children running through old streets, in the echo of live music spilling into Roman squares. The 8,000-year-old city still breathes, still changes, still whispers stories you can only hear when night falls. That night, if you walk across the Maritsa Bridge and look toward the 7 hills glowing softly in gold, you'll see that Plovdiv never truly sleeps. It merely closes its eyes, dreaming of itself, of ages gone and centuries yet to be written. This is Lunora, where history sleeps softly beneath the stars. Long before Plovdiv had a name, before writing, before the first walls of stone, there were people who stopped by the banks of the Maritsa River. They didn't come seeking power or glory, but something far older and simpler: fear. They feared the hunger of winter, the beasts in the forest, the floods that would swallow their fields when the rains came. But it was fear that taught them to stay together instead of wandering endlessly across the wild. And so, out of fear, a city began to form. The first people built huts of branches, then of clay, then of stone. They learned to store seeds, to shape pottery, to tend fire. They carved symbols into rocks, not to tell stories, but to remember. Perhaps, deep down, they already knew that human memory is fragile, but the earth remembers longer. Those carvings became the first language of this land, a voice with no name. The Maritsa River did more than carry water. It brought life and unease. Each rainy season, its rising flood renewed the soil, but threatened to wash away everything they had built. Yet instead of leaving, they stayed, year after year, generation after generation. Maybe they understood something that humankind often forgets. What we fear the most is often what keeps us alive the longest. The hills around Plovdiv, Nebet Tepe, Jambaz, Taksim, were once just high ground to escape the floods, but slowly people began to build upon them: wooden fences, hearths, granaries, then temples. What began as refuge became sacred, and what was sacred became the heart of life itself. Perhaps there, on those ancient hills, Plovdiv took its first breath, like a small heart beating in the vast plain. The world back then knew nothing of empires. There were no kings, no armies, only small communities bound by the need to survive. And within those fragile circles of life, Plovdiv became one of humanity's earliest sparks, a place where people learned to live with nature instead of against it. Every hill became a memory, every layer of soil, a silent age recorded not in words, but in endurance. When modern archaeologists dug deep beneath Plovdiv, they found charred fragments of pottery, carbonized grains of wheat, and simple stone tools. But what they could not measure was what still lingers between those layers, the breath of the first people who lived with fear and from it built the foundations of civilization. Perhaps every city begins with ambition, but Plovdiv began with fear, and that is why it wasn't built only of stone, but of the instinct to survive. When night falls over the Maritsa, if you listen closely, you might still hear them, the first ones, whispering through the buried earth that fear is not weakness, but the very seed of existence. And from that seed, another civilization would rise, Eumolpia, the forgotten Thracian city, whose traces still lie somewhere beneath the homes of today. Before the Greeks wrote their myths and long before Rome built its stone roads, this land belonged to the Thracians, a mysterious, powerful people almost erased from humanity's memory. They were the ones who gave Plovdiv its first name, Eumolpia, the place of gentle songs. That name still lingers today, soft and distant like a melody the world has forgotten how to sing. The Thracians left behind no grand monuments, no eternal scriptures. They didn't carve their victories in stone. They let time remember them through the earth. They believed that soil was both the beginning and the end of every soul. The people never truly die. They simply return to the ground like seeds awaiting another spring. Because of that, the lands around Plovdiv are dotted with hundreds of round burial mounds, tumuli, resting places of warriors, priestesses, and small kings, all lying with their heads toward the rising and setting sun. Eumolpia was not a bustling city, but a sacred center. The Thracians built temples of stone, not large, but always on high ground, where sky and earth could meet in the first light of dawn. They believed that in that open space between heaven and soil, the gods could hear them, and during every ritual they did not beg, they sang. They sang to the sky, to the river, to the wind that crossed the valleys, as if music itself was the bridge between humankind and the cosmos. Those songs are lost now. Yet sometimes when the wind sweeps over the hills of Plovdiv, people say you can still hear a faint echo, not the wind, but the lingering voice of Eumolpia. The city may have been small, but it was the heart of Thracian spirit, where faith, art, and harmony with nature merged into a wordless language. The Thracians were master goldsmiths. In their hands, gold became sacred, not for display, but as a vessel to guide the soul to the afterlife. The golden masks found near Plovdiv, the wine cups engraved with lions and eagles, all whisper the same truth. To them, life and death were not opposites, but two rhythms of the same song. Eumolpia was also a place of gathering, where tribes met to trade goods, share wine, and tell stories. From here, the first routes connected Thrace to the Aegean Sea, opening the region's earliest paths of commerce and exchange. No one could have imagined that one day those same roads would carry a tide of change when the Greeks arrived, bringing their letters, their philosophy, and their hunger to expand the world. But before that moment came, Eumolpia had already lived fully in its own time, like a flower blooming in silence without needing light or fame. It stood for an age when humans still felt the presence of the divine in every stone, and could still hear the voice of the earth beneath their feet. And then, one day, from beyond the mountains, the Greeks appeared, bringing new sounds, new walls, and a new way of seeing eternity. They would not destroy Eumolpia, but they would rename it, and from that moment a new chapter began in the chapter of Philippopolis, the city that would bear the name of a king. When Eumolpia was still a city of rough stone and sacred ritual, the south had already begun to stir. From the shores of the Aegean, Greek ships drifted quietly along rivers and dusty roads, carrying merchants, scholars, and soldiers, men who sought not only goods, but influence. It was the 7th century before the Common Era, an age when the world was beginning to stretch beyond tribes and step into the era of names and order. The Greeks did not come with swords. They came with language, with writing, with a way of reshaping everything they touched. In Eumolpia, they saw a place of promise, nestled between a great river and defensible hills, a perfect site for trade and power. And so, layer by layer, Thracian culture began to merge with the Greek voice, like two streams of different colors flowing together, impossible to separate again. Archaeologists have found traces of Greek inscriptions carved into stone columns in Plovdiv, yet beneath them still lie the Thracian foundations, circular homes, hearths, and stone tombs. It seems the Greeks did not erase the past, they built the future upon its back. That was how their civilization spread, not by destruction but by absorption. And in that process, Eumolpia received a new name. According to legend, Alexander the Great, or more precisely his father, Philip II of Macedon, conquered this region in the 4th century before the Common Era. He renamed Eumolpia to Philippopolis, the city of Philip. From that moment, the city stepped out of the mists of the local and into the written history of empires, onto maps, into chronicles, into ambition. The Thracians still lived here, but they slowly became shadows within the story written by the Greeks. The language changed, the architecture changed, the faith changed. On the hilltop, temples to Zeus and Athena rose, replacing the old stone altars of river and sun gods. Yet sometimes beneath the Greek sanctuaries, archaeologists still find small hidden statues, ancient Thracian deities buried like secrets, surviving in silence. And like every city that has ever changed its name, Philippopolis became a mirror, reflecting two civilizations at once. By day, it spoke Greek, traded in markets, debated philosophy, built columns and walls. But at night, among the limestone houses, Thracians still lit torches and sang the old songs, songs of the earth, of the river, of the hill called Nebet Tepe, where they believed their ancestors' gods still kept watch. As the Greek world spread from the Aegean to Egypt, Philippopolis remained something different, not a city of conquest, but of blending. Each generation added a layer, not to erase the old, but to live alongside it. Perhaps it was this quiet harmony that gave Plovdiv its strange endurance, allowing it to survive 8,000 years without ever disappearing. But the glory of Greece was only a moment in the long rhythm of time. From the west, a new force was rising, not in the image of philosophers, but of soldiers in iron armor, men who believed eternity could be built with stone and discipline. The Romans were coming, and with them, Philippopolis would change once more, not just its name, but its very soul. Under the reign of Philip II of Macedon, the city was renamed, a gesture that was both political and deeply symbolic. Philippopolis was not just a new name, it was a declaration of order, a sign that a new vision had taken hold, one where reason began to rise above tradition, and the city itself became a tool of empire. Yet beneath the freshly laid stones and towering walls, the breath of Eumolpia still lingered, buried but never gone. Philip II saw more than a strategic outpost between the Balkans and the Aegean. He saw a meeting point, a crossroads where the past and the future could shake hands. He expanded the city, strengthened its fortifications, and turned it into a hub of trade and defense connecting the sea to the continent. Philippopolis became the beating heart of Thrace, where merchants, soldiers, artists, and philosophers all passed through, each leaving behind their mark. When the Romans arrived a few centuries later, they didn't destroy what Philip had built. They perfected it in their own way. With marble and measured streets, with aqueducts and laws, they reshaped the city into something grander and more precise. Under Rome, Philippopolis flourished with a forum, a grand theater, public baths, and an intricate water system. Everything was built according to geometry and discipline. The streets crossed like threads on a loom, forming a grid of perfect symmetry. The great theater of Philippopolis, carved into the hillside, still stands today. Over 2,000 years ago, Romans sat on those same stone seats to watch plays, recite poetry, and witness the comedy and tragedy of their own humanity reflected on stage. When the wind passes through it now, you can almost hear the applause, the cheers, the voices of actors echoing against the mountain walls, as if time itself never left. During its Roman age, Philippopolis lay along the Road of the Emperors, a vital trade route linking the Black Sea to the Adriatic. Caravans carrying wine, oil, ceramics, and silk rolled through its streets each day. Warehouses, potteries, bathhouses, and bustling markets rose along the Maritsa River. Yet amidst the order and prosperity, the people held onto something uniquely their own, the habit of singing while they worked, the harvest festivals, the small lamps glowing along the riverbanks at night, echoes of old Eumolpia that refused to fade. The city became a meeting ground of memory, where Greek, Thracian, and Roman worlds coexisted beneath the same sky. The Romans believed everything could be measured, built, and replicated, but no matter how perfect their designs, one thing in Philippopolis resisted all order: its soul. And so, through wars and plagues, Philippopolis endured. It was never the city of tyrants, but of rhythm and reason. Every stone laid carried the quiet belief that humankind could outlast time through structure. Yet, in a paradox of fate, it was that very faith and permanence that created something truly eternal, not an empire, but a city. Eventually, the Roman Empire itself would crumble. The legions would march away. The forums would fall silent, and the marble streets would be overgrown with grass. But Philippopolis would not die. Beneath the ground, under layers of stone, memory continued to smolder, waiting for another age, another faith, to awaken it. And as the long night of empire descended, a new light began to flicker in the east, the light of Byzantium. The age of emperors would give way to the age of icons, candles, and whispered prayers. Philippopolis would rise again, not as a city of kings, but as a city of faith. When the Romans arrived, Philippopolis became more than a city. It became an idea of eternity. The Romans may not have created its soul, but they gave it form, order, and rhythm, a steady heartbeat carved into stone. They believed that through stone, humanity could preserve itself longer than through any hymn or legend ever written. It began with the roads. The Romans laid white stone paths that cut straight through the city, connecting forums, baths, temples, and gates. Each slab was placed with care, strong enough to bear the weight of thousands of footsteps, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, children, and nameless wanderers. These roads didn't just link places together, they connected meanings, a quiet reminder that every road in the end leads to the same center, the heart of the city. At that heart stood the Roman Forum, where voices and power became one. Every morning, citizens gathered to debate laws, hear news from afar, or simply watch the sunlight drift across the Corinthian columns. At dusk, the same square filled with music, laughter, and stories, the sounds of ordinary life moving in the rhythm of centuries of discipline. But the most striking symbol of Roman Philippopolis wasn't in the Forum. It was the great stone theater carved into the mountain slope. More than 30 rows of seats were hewn directly from the hillside, facing the valley so that the wind could carry the actors' voices far beyond the stage. The Romans needed no roof, for they believed the sky itself was the grandest ceiling. Here, tragedy and comedy intertwined. The tales of gods and mortals, of love and death, replayed for generations. Perhaps on some ancient summer night, as moonlight touched the cold stone seats, a soldier wept at the story of Orestes, a young woman laughed at the sound of a flute, and a poet realized it was not Rome, but here, that the true heart of time was beating. The Romans also brought bathhouses, underground aqueducts, and feats of engineering so intricate that even centuries later we still marvel at their design. But beyond their skill, they carried a belief that humanity could shape the world in its own image through structure and will. Philippopolis became living proof of that faith, a city where every stone had its place and every pillar had its purpose. When night fell, Roman torches lit the main streets. Flames danced across marble walls, glimmered on statues of gods, and rippled over the silent flow of the river. There was a serene beauty in that order, not a harsh control, but a harmony that lived in every breath. Those who walked the streets might not have known it, but they were moving through a vast metaphor, that Rome did not simply build cities of stone, but of belief, the belief that life could be arranged and beauty could endure through law. Then, as always, time began to draw the light away from those squares. The empire expanded too far, then grew weary. The legions marched home. The roads were no longer repaired, and in Philippopolis the wind carried dust from the east, the dust of new wars, new faiths, and a world slowly transforming in shadow. Yet the city remained steadfast as the marble from which it was born. And when the Roman bells fell silent, another sound began to rise, deeper, softer, but just as enduring, the prayers of Byzantium, drawing near like the quiet breath of a new age. There are places where sound never truly dies. It only hides within the stone, waiting for someone quiet enough to hear it. In Plovdiv, where the hillside overlooks the Maritsa River, there is such a place, the Roman theater. It is not merely a ruin. It is the heart of time itself, where every step of stone, every crack, every trace of light still holds a voice from thousands of years ago. The theater was carved directly into the southern slope of the city during the reign of Emperor Trajan in the 1st century after the birth of Christ. Around 5,000 people once sat here in golden afternoons to watch Greek tragedies, hear speeches, or listen to music carried on the breath of the Roman Empire. There were no backdrops, no ceilings, only the open sky as its roof and the surrounding hills as its walls. Everything was designed so that sound could travel flawlessly. Even today, if you stand on the stage and speak softly, your voice will reach the highest rows with perfect clarity. The Roman engineers built not only with skill, but with intuition, with an understanding of nature that feels almost poetic. They knew how the wind moved, where light fell, how a human voice would echo between stone and air, and because of that, after 2,000 years, the theater remains so intact that it barely needed restoration. It stands as proof that true beauty does not need protection, only to be listened to. If you visit Plovdiv today, you can walk up those ancient stone steps. Each one still bears the worn marks of countless feet. Perhaps in a quiet afternoon, when the city's noise fades away, you might hear what the Romans once heard, the whisper of time. It isn't imagination, but physics. Old sounds really do linger trapped in the cavities of stone, a mystery that science still cannot fully explain. This place has seen everything: festivals and executions, tragedies and celebrations, prayers and screams. It was once buried by a landslide, forgotten for centuries, until it was rediscovered in the 1970s when workers began cutting a road into the hill. No one expected that beneath layers of dirt and weeds, a heart of stone was still beating. When the first sunlight touched the ancient seats, the excavators wept, not for history, but for the feeling that someone from thousands of years ago was still watching, still waiting to be heard again. Now, every summer, Plovdiv once more fills the theater with life. Modern lights mix with moonlight, violins blend with the wind, and in the night air the music rises again as if 2,000 years had never passed. Not every city has a place where past and present can sit side by side, but Plovdiv does, and perhaps if you stand in the highest seat and look down at the softly glowing stage, you'll realize this is not a ruin. It is the ear of time, listening, remembering, reminding us that some sounds belong neither to the past nor the present, but to eternity. From this place, the city would continue to change. The Roman Empire would fade, churches would rise where temples once stood, and prayers would replace the voices of the stage. Yet through it all, Plovdiv would keep one gift, the gift of listening, because perhaps in that stillness a city learns how to endure forever, and from these lingering echoes Byzantium would emerge, not as a conqueror, but as a slow-burning candle, kindling light in the fading twilight of a dying empire. When the Roman banners finally fell, there was no thunder, no bloodshed, only a strange, weightless silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Philippopolis, deep in the heart of the Balkans, did not collapse. It simply changed its rhythm. Above the old Roman squares where torches once burned bright, there now rose the soft toll of bells, prayers whispered through the mist. The Byzantine age had begun, and the city entered a new chapter, one where power no longer came from the sword, but from faith. Byzantium did not conquer Plovdiv with armies. The empire of the East spread through symbols, rituals, and the quiet glow of gold-covered churches. The city took on a new name, Tremontium, the city of three hills, a name that felt like a prayer, a reminder that this was more than a remnant of the past. It was a meeting point between heaven and earth, where humanity and God regarded one another in silence. The Byzantines did not erase the Roman traces. They simply dressed them in a new skin, lighter yet deeper. Over the old theaters they built churches. Between Corinthian columns they hung icons of saints. The golden candlelight reflected off walls once carved with imperial names, softening them as if the stones themselves were repenting for their past. In Plovdiv, faith did not begin through destruction, began through continuation. In the 6th century, under Emperor Justinian, Tremontium became part of the empire's great defensive chain. The city walls were strengthened, the streets relaid, and the old Roman baths turned into monasteries. Life no longer revolved around public spectacle, but around inner light, the kind seen only when one looks upward in prayer. Life moved slower then, quieter, more deliberate. On the hills, monks lived in solitude, copying holy texts by hand, letter by letter, on parchment. They did not know that in doing so, they were preserving the memory of humankind through the dark centuries that were coming. Down in the valley, people still traded, still grew grapes, still lit their lamps at night. Yet inside, the world had changed. The gods of wind and river were gone, replaced by one enduring faith, silent but steadfast. On winter nights, when mist rose from the Maritsa River, Plovdiv seemed to dissolve into the clouds, small, contemplative, but unyielding, like a candle that never goes out. The Byzantines called it the shining point of the frontier, for while chaos swallowed much of the Balkans, Tremontium endured, held together by faith and discipline, but no light lasts forever. By the 9th century, new figures appeared from the north, horsemen speaking strange tongues, bearing wolf emblems on their shields, and carrying in their hearts a different kind of yearning, not for conquest, but for belonging. They were the Bulgars, and they did not come to steal faith, but to redefine what homeland meant for this land. And in that fragile moment between two worlds, between Rome and Bulgaria, between the divine and the human, Plovdiv stood still, It had learned something that few cities ever do, that when empires sleep, a city must learn to breathe quietly, and it was that very silence, gentle, patient, enduring, that saved it. From the north they came like the first cold wind of winter, the Bulgars, riding horses, cloaked in fur, their shields engraved with suns, and their faith rooted not in gods, but in themselves. They did not arrive in ships like the Greeks, nor bring laws like the Romans, nor the gilded icons of Byzantium. What they carried was the will to survive, a will forged through centuries of wandering, fighting, and enduring, and that, more than anything, allowed them to merge with this land, not as conquerors, but as children returning home. In the 9th century, as the Byzantine Empire weakened under the weight of invasions and division, the Bulgars advanced into Thrace and set foot upon Tremontium, the Byzantine name for Plovdiv. The city that had once echoed with hymns and church bells now heard again the sound of hooves and steel. Yet rather than destroy, they rebuilt. They saw in the old Roman walls a foundation worth keeping, and in the ancient streets a memory worth continuing. At first, the Byzantines called them barbarians, but in a few short generations, something remarkable happened. The Bulgars learned everything the Eastern Empire had spent centuries refining. They'd learned to build churches, to write, to govern through law. With the guidance of two Byzantine monks, Cyril and Methodius, they created the Slavic alphabet, weaving Christianity into their new language. From that moment on, Bulgaria became not merely a kingdom of warriors, but a nation of letters and faith. Plovdiv became the crossroads of two worlds, between old Rome and the new Bulgaria, between Latin and Slav, between faith received and faith reimagined. On its hills, Orthodox domes rose green and gold beneath the morning light. Below them, the remnants of Roman foundations remained. Where children played, monks passed, and merchants gathered during harvest season. It was an age when fire and faith lived side by side. The Bulgars believed this land must be defended not only with swords, but with prayers. Around Plovdiv, they built small fortresses, not merely as defenses, but as declarations. We will remain here. And they did. Even as wars raged between Bulgaria and Byzantium, Plovdiv stood as a quiet mediator, a place where two empires could meet, not in peace, but in the silent respect that history demands. When the sun set over the Maritsa River, smoke curled from homes into the mist, and the sound of church bells mingled with the distant drums of war. A city both praying and preparing, a perfect paradox, mirroring the very soul of Plovdiv. For from this moment on, it would no longer belong to any empire. It would become the edge of the world, a place where civilizations come and go, and yet it remains. In the 10th century, Plovdiv changed hands many times, Byzantines reclaiming it, then losing it, then reclaiming it again. Each time the city learned a new way to survive. When Byzantine flags flew, Plovdiv prayed. When Bulgarian banners rose, it fought. Between those two extremes, it chose neither side. It chose continuity, because perhaps Plovdiv understood something no empire ever could, that power always changes, but the spirit of the land does not. And within every flame, whether born of war or of candlelight, there burns one constant light. That light would travel through centuries yet to come, through the rise of the Ottomans, through blood, through trade, through faith. But before the domes of Islam appeared, before Arabic prayers echoed among the Thracian hills, Plovdiv would endure one last long night, a night of division and trial, when Byzantium, desperate and fading, would try one final time to hold this land and fail. In 1364, when Ottoman horsemen crossed the Balkan mountains, the crescent moon appeared for the first time over the skies of Plovdiv. They called the city Philippopolis, a name borrowed from Philippopolis, but its soul had already changed. From that moment began a new era, 5 centuries of moonlight, wind, and markets, when Plovdiv became a bridge between two halves of the world, East and West, Christianity and Islam, Europe and Asia. The Ottomans did not destroy Plovdiv. They did not burn, level, or bury it. Instead, they added another layer of time atop what already existed. Upon Byzantine foundations, they built mosques. Beside old churches, they raised domed bazaars. Along ancient Roman streets, they opened coffee houses and weaving workshops. The city did not lose its spirit. It simply found a new rhythm, slower, warmer, scented with incense and roasted coffee. The first domes rose like inverted moons, casting a soft shimmer across the Maritsa River. The call to prayer from Jumiah Mosque echoed through the air, blending with church bells and the hammering of looms from the artisans' quarter. Plovdiv entered an age of coexistence, where faiths, languages, and traditions breathed the same air. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the city flourished. From Istanbul came caravans laden with silk, spices, glass, and porcelain, stopping in Plovdiv on their way to Central Europe. Around the square, caravanserai, inns for travelers, were built, where Persians, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, and Slavs shared dinner under a common roof. If you stand today in Shiftabanya, once a grand twin bathhouse from the 15th century, you can almost imagine the mist, the scent of amber and soap, and the murmur of a dozen languages swirling together like smoke. Ottoman culture left more than architecture. It left a sense of time. Days began with the call to prayer, swelled with the aroma of coffee by noon, came alive with the bustle of markets in the afternoon, and ended with the quiet hour of storytelling. The first coffee houses of Plovdiv were not merely shops. They were salons where scholars debated, poets recited verses, and merchants discussed trade routes and destiny. Within a vast empire, Philippopolis became a beacon of gentle civilization, a place where communication mattered more than conquest. Of course, there were shadows. Under Ottoman rule, Bulgaria lost its statehood, and Plovdiv, of its ancient heart, became just one node in a distant web of imperial governance. Yet the people endured. They lived, married, told stories by the fire, and quietly preserved their identity. In their 2-story wooden houses, blending Balkan and Islamic design, they hid small Christian icons behind curtains, lit candles in the dark, and sang in forbidden tongues. The city learned a new art, the art of surviving in silence. By the 18th century, as the Ottoman Empire began to tire, Plovdiv became the whispering cradle of a new awakening. Wealthy Bulgarian merchants founded secret schools, printed books, and taught children their native language. While the Sultan in Istanbul still believed his world unshakable, in Plovdiv, a quiet resurrection had already begun in hidden rooms beneath the flicker of oil lamps. By day, Philippopolis remained an Ottoman city, full of merchants' cries and the scent of basil and spice, but at night, in wooden houses tucked against the hills, Bulgarians whispered old songs to their children, tales of Thracian ancestors, of Eumolpia, and of the sacred hills. The city became an Eastern tapestry, woven from many threads, the gold of Islam, the red of the Balkans, and the blue of Roman memory. And then, after 5 centuries under the crescent moon, another light began to flicker in the west, the light of the 19th century of revolution and awakening. As gunfire echoed through the Rhodope Mountains and Sofia rose in defiance, Plovdiv knew it was about to change its name once more, not to forget, but to remember. Amid the long Ottoman centuries, Plovdiv, or Philippopolis as the Turks called it, lived in a strange rhythm, slow, deep, and resonant, like the sound of an oud echoing through a quiet night. It was no longer a city of empire, nor yet a city of freedom. It had become a crossroads of the soul, where goods, languages, and prayers all passed through, leaving traces on every brick, every bridge, every dome, breathing the scent of incense. By day, Plovdiv was the city of markets. From across the Balkans came traders bearing wool, timber, salt, and wine. From the east arrived caravans with Persian silk, Yemeni coffee, and Indian spices. They all met beneath the domed roof of the Bedestan, the oldest covered bazaar in the region. The air was thick with the rhythm of trade, the shouts of merchants, the clinking of coins, the jingle of mule bells, and the sweet mix of cinnamon, pepper, and honey. Each stall sold not only goods, but stories, tales of desert crossings, storms at sea, and the endless Silk Road stretching from China to Istanbul, pausing for a breath here. Along the Maritsa River, stone bridges linked the two banks like sentences connecting different eras. On one side lived the Bulgarian quarter, wooden houses, vineyards, and small churches hidden behind fig trees. On the other side, the Turkish quarter, domed roofs, slender minarets, and courtyards echoing with prayer. Between these worlds, the river flowed quietly, not dividing, but reflecting. The moonlight from church towers, the lanterns from mosques, both merging on its surface. When sunset fell, Plovdiv changed its voice. The markets closed, but the coffee houses opened. Wooden chairs lined the porches where men sat smoking pipes, sipping thick coffee, and speaking softly of politics and fate. In this city, coffee was more than a drink. It was a ritual, a way to stretch time, to reflect, to listen to the whisper of the city itself. They said that in Philippopolis, no one ever spoke loudly. Even arguments were wrapped in the gentleness of people who had learned to live long beside one another. Faith in Ottoman Plovdiv carried that same harmony, many voiced but never clashing. Each morning the call to prayer from the minarets blended with the chime of Orthodox bells, and sometimes the songs of Sephardic Jews drifted from a small southern quarter. People lived together not because they understood one another, but because they had learned they didn't have to understand to coexist. Here, faith was not a boundary. It was the heartbeat of daily life. The Orthodox churches of that era were built low without tall towers. Ottoman law forbade them from rising higher than a mosque. But inside, Bulgarians quietly covered the walls in gold, lit candles through the night, and taught their children to read scripture in Slavonic. They lived like roots, unseen, but nourishing strength beneath the surface. And in that silence, the Bulgarian spirit was preserved, passed down one generation at a time. By the 18th century, Plovdiv began to stir. Bulgarian merchants, trading across Europe, returned with books and new ideas of enlightenment, liberty, and education. In the great houses along Kapana Hill, they opened secret schools, invited teachers from the West, and taught their children that a nation lives only as long as its memory does. Those small lamps, flickering quietly in the dark, were enough to light the century ahead. Ottoman Plovdiv was more than a city of domes and bazaars. It was a symphony of memory and endurance. Each passing day, it learned new ways to survive, through fragrance, through language, through the gaze of those who refused to forget. And when the Ottoman Empire finally began to tremble, it was cities like Plovdiv, quiet, patient, wise, that had already prepared the ground for a forgotten nation's rebirth. For when the crescent moon began to fade, the dawn of the Bulgarian revival was already rising over these hills. And from the hushed streets of Plovdiv, a new flame was kindled, not to burn, but to illuminate. At the dawn of the 19th century, Plovdiv was like a small lamp flickering through the long night of Ottoman rule. On the surface, it was still Philippopolis, a quiet provincial town where the call to prayer rose faithfully from the minarets and the markets opened on time each morning. But beneath that calm exterior, a silent awakening was spreading, like embers under ash, preparing to ignite the Bulgarian national revival. After 5 centuries in the empire's shadow, The Bulgarians of Plovdiv no longer believed freedom would come from swords. They believed it began with memory, with remembering who they were. And so, in the yellow and blue wooden houses along the slopes of Kapana, small candles began to be lit, not in churches, but in schools. Wealthy merchants who had traveled through Vienna, Budapest, and Istanbul returned home carrying not only goods, but ideas. That knowledge was the foundation of a nation. They founded Chitalishta, reading rooms in community schools where children learned to write in Bulgarian, where young men read poetry, wrote plays, and discussed the lost glory of their ancestors. On the walls hung maps of ancient Thrace, and they would whisper to one another, "We were once part of something greater." Plovdiv, perfectly placed between the great trade routes, became the intellectual heart of the Bulgarian revival. Here, the monk Paisi Hilandarsky, regarded as the father of Bulgarian national consciousness, had left behind his manuscript, The History of the Slavo-Bulgarian People, a work written in darkness, yet carrying the force of lightning. In it he urged, "Do not be ashamed that you are Bulgarian." Those words echoed through the homes of Plovdiv, copied by hand, passed from person to person, a new kind of prayer. The next generation no longer bowed their heads. They began to write in their mother tongue, to sing banned folk songs, to print books in secret. In 1867, Bulgaria's first newspaper, Maritsa, was born right here in Plovdiv, a symbol of intellect reclaimed not through war, but through ink. Every printed word in Bulgarian was more than news. It was proof. We still speak, we still think, we still exist. At the same time, art bloomed. The Bulgarian revival houses rose along the steep streets, with curved eaves, wide windows, and bright colors painted like dreams. Each home was a declaration. We are no longer afraid to be seen. Their golden and crimson walls still stand today, witnesses to a time when people learned again how to stand tall and speak their name aloud. But every awakening has its cost. The Ottoman authorities soon realized that Philippe was no longer obedient. Schools were closed and teachers arrested, books burned. Yet the people of Plovdiv did not stop. When they couldn't teach by day, they taught by night. When ink was forbidden, they carved letters into wood. Every child who learned a single Bulgarian word was a small victory, and thousands of such small victories built the foundation for a nation about to be reborn. By the 1870s, as uprisings rippled across the Balkans, Plovdiv did not take up the sword. It held on to its memory. And when revolutionaries from across the land arrived, they found not just allies, but a refuge for the Bulgarian soul. Once the Ottoman administrative heart of the region, the city had quietly become the womb of the future, a future that would belong not to the empire, but to itself. On the night before liberation, people said the Maritsa River flowed in unusual silence. No wind, no sound, only the flicker of countless lights in the hillside homes, thousands of candles whispering the same prayer, that when freedom came, they would remember not only the warriors who fought, but those who had kept memory alive. And then, in 1878, that prayer was answered. The Ottomans withdrew. The Bulgarian flag rose for the first time in 5 centuries. Yet Plovdiv's story did not end there. For at the next bend of history, another division was already waiting. In the spring of 1878, as the snow melted along the Maritsa River, Plovdiv heard a new sound, the rhythm of hooves no longer bearing the crescent moon, but the echo of freedom. The Ottoman soldiers withdrew in silence, carrying their faded banners, and after 5 long centuries, the city exhaled, like someone awakening from a deep dream. People flooded the streets, hung flags from balconies, embraced one another, and wept without words. They did not shout like victors, they trembled like souls who had just been given back their own names. But history, as always, grants no perfect gifts. The Treaty of Berlin, signed just months after the Russo-Turkish War ended, tore Bulgaria in two. The north became the autonomous kingdom of Bulgaria, while the south, and where Plovdiv stood, was placed under a new name, Eastern Rumelia, a self-governing province still under Ottoman authority. Freedom had reached the doorstep, but not yet entered the house. Once again, the city found itself between two worlds, between liberty and restraint, homeland and empire. Now the capital of Eastern Rumelia, Plovdiv, wore a curious beauty, half European, half Eastern. On its hills, bright Bulgarian revival houses still rose, yet in the streets below, Ottoman officials in long robes stamped decrees with the seal of the Sultan. One city, two heartbeats. People prayed in church in the morning and paid taxes to Istanbul in the afternoon. There were no walls dividing them, but there was an invisible crack within every heart. Yet Plovdiv refused to wait for history's permission. The city's scholars, merchants, and clergy understood that if freedom would not be granted, it had to be claimed. Plovdiv began to live with two faces, one public, obedient to the empire's laws, and one secret, keeping in its chest the map of a united Bulgaria. Underground societies formed, letters crossed borders in code, and in the attics of quiet houses people whispered, "There can be no Bulgaria without Plovdiv." In 1885, that whisper became flame. The citizens of Plovdiv, led by young intellectuals, rose and declared the unification of Bulgaria. No shots were fired, no blood spilled, only flags unfurled across the city, and the church bells rang without pause for a full day and night. When the news reached Sofia, the entire nation trembled. North and South were joined not by foreign power, but by the will of their own people. In that moment, Plovdiv was not just a city. It was the heart of a newborn Bulgaria. They say that on the night after the unification, hundreds of oil lamps burned along the slopes of Nebet-Tepe Hill. Their light shimmered over rooftops and across the Maritsa like 1,000 fallen stars scattered upon the earth. No one slept. Everyone knew they were living through a night that would be told and retold for generations. Freedom, when it came, did not arrive with gunfire, but with a sigh of relief. Yet Plovdiv understood something profound, that freedom is not an ending, but the beginning of a new responsibility to protect what was won through memory from being lost again to forgetfulness. The following decades were not easy. Disputes over borders, politics, and economics shook the city many times. Yet through it all, Plovdiv remained the pulse of the Bulgarian soul. It was no longer the capital of a province, but the capital of remembrance, where Bulgarians learned to be both proud and humble, to look toward the future while still holding on to their sacred hills. By the end of the 19th century, Plovdiv was older, yet its light had not dimmed. Beneath every dome, children read their lessons. Beneath every bridge, the river still flowed toward freedom. And above it all, the Bulgarian flag fluttered in the open sky, this time beyond the reach of any hand that might tear it down. But the dawn of a nation is never the end of struggle. As Europe stepped into the 20th century, bringing with it machines, wars, and divisions, Plovdiv would once again have to learn how to survive the storm of history, quietly, steadfastly, as it always had. At the dawn of the 20th century, Plovdiv stood between two winds, one blowing from the past, the other from the future. To the east, Istanbul remained the city of crescents, the heart of a fading empire. To the west, Vienna and Paris glimmered with light, steam, and the hum of waltzes, and in between, Plovdiv turned to both horizons and chose what it had always done best, to connect. Freedom had only just taken root, and young Bulgaria was still learning to define itself. Plovdiv, after centuries of changing names and rulers, seemed to understand that names didn't matter. What mattered was keeping the bridge between worlds intact. Here, You could see an Orthodox church standing beside an old mosque, a Turkish cafe facing an Austrian bakery, and Bulgarian women in embroidered skirts walking past Greek merchants in European coats. The city became a mirror of its time, where the past and the present looked at each other with equal parts nostalgia and doubt. On its cobbled streets, the clatter of carriage wheels mingled with the footsteps of travelers carrying suitcases, merchants from Bucharest, Athens, even Trieste. Once a provincial capital, Plovdiv bloomed again as a center of trade, culture, and thought for the Balkans. But more than prosperity, what set Plovdiv apart was its attitude toward time. In Sofia, the new capital, people rushed to build Western-style architecture, chasing industry and modernity, forgetting the old stones beneath their feet. In Plovdiv, the Bulgarian revival houses were lovingly preserved. Their wide windows opened to small gardens where elders sat reading newspapers over cups of coffee. The city did not resist modernity, but neither did it kneel before it. It simply slowed down, as if giving the world a moment to breathe. In the 1910s, as Europe drifted toward war, Plovdiv remained calm. Poets and musicians gathered in cafes along the hills, speaking of art, philosophy, and things that transcended borders. Here, people believed that culture needed no nationality, that humans might differ in language, yet were the same in how they listened. And indeed, when you walk through Kapana, the trap, you understand. The narrow streets weaved like a maze, but not to make you lost, to make you find. In the tiny workshops, craftsmen carve wood, weave textiles, and mold brass, trades passed down for generations. They work slowly, deliberately, as if every object they create isn't just to be sold, but to tell a story. That is how Plovdiv lives, through tangible memory, through the patience of hands. The 20th century, however, brought trials. The Balkan Wars, followed by the First World War, sent away sons who never returned. Yet amid gunfire and grief, Plovdiv held on to something unbreakable, its capacity to heal. When funerals passed, Greek neighbors helped Bulgarian families carry coffins. Jewish voices sang prayers for Muslim friends. Here, division never quite managed to defeat the memory of coexistence. By 1920, with the war behind, Plovdiv looked like a stitch across the torn fabric of the Balkans, a seam sewn with golden thread. Music filled the streets again, the markets reopened, and schools taught in Bulgarian while still reciting Greek poetry and French verse. A new generation was born, one that had never known enslavement, yet carried in its soul the calm resilience of those who had lived through empires. In the summer dusk, as the sun sank behind Nebet Tepe hill, the city seemed to dissolve into light. Church bells rang, the call to prayer answered, and the wind from the Maritsa drifted across the old rooftops. East and west, new and old, all blended together, not as opposites, but as two halves of the same soul. Plovdiv in that moment did not need to choose. It was not the West, nor fully the East. It was simply itself, a place where everything once passed through, yet nothing ever truly left. And as the 20th century began to roar, as humanity tumbled into the madness of war, Plovdiv would once again prove that the true strength of a city lies not in its victories, but in its ability to keep loving after the ruins. When the 20th century truly began, Plovdiv entered an age of chaos and smoke. Freedom, won barely half a century earlier, was already being tested, as if history itself wished to see what the city had learned after thousands of years of endurance. Between two world wars would sweep across Europe like storms, and though Plovdiv was never the center of battle, it still absorbed the weary sigh of humankind. During the First World War, Bulgaria chose the wrong side and paid the price. Young men from Plovdiv marched away with hurriedly written letters in their pockets, and many never returned. On the hills where songs of festivals once echoed, only the tolling of church bells remained, praying for their souls. The city carried on. It traded, it studied, it lived, yet in every home there was a pause, a quiet space where a soldier's photograph stood beside a candle that burned through the night. When the war ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire had fallen, but Plovdiv still bore its traces: domed houses, old coffee houses, and markets with Arabic names. The people did not tear them down. They simply moved forward. Perhaps they had finally learned that history cannot be erased by a hammer. It can only be softened by time. By the 1930s, Europe was beginning to lose its mind again. Hitler rose to power, and waves of extremism swept the continent. Bulgaria was pulled into the gravity of war, but Plovdiv, in its timeless way, chose a different path: to heal rather than harm. When anti-Jewish laws were passed, Bulgarians, Turks, and Armenians alike helped hide Jewish families in the old quarter. Many survived in the damp cellars beneath houses once used to store wine or olive oil. There were no grand proclamations of heroism, only quiet acts, and it was those quiet acts that saved lives. During the Second World War, as bombs fell on Sofia, many fled to Plovdiv. The city opened its arms, as it always had, to Thracians, to Greeks, to Ottomans, and now to refugees. They crowded into wooden houses, sharing food, water, and hope. Even as distant explosions trembled through the night, people still believed that here the flame of humanity had not gone out. When the war ended in 1945, Bulgaria changed course, stepping into the communist era. A new flag was raised along with a promise of equality and progress. But Plovdiv, a city that had survived empires and kingdoms alike, no longer believed in promises. It believed only in time. While other places tore down the old to make way for monuments of the new, Plovdiv quietly preserved its ancient walls, its small churches, its uneven brick streets. Perhaps it knew that the new would one day grow old, and only what refused to chase the present would truly endure. In the years that followed, as the red shadow spread across Eastern Europe, Plovdiv lived like an island wrapped in silence. The old quarters were abandoned as people moved into concrete apartment blocks, but the houses remained, waiting for the day someone would remember them. Beneath the ground, the Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman ruins slept undisturbed, as if they too knew that one day someone would return to wake them. Through 2 world wars, Plovdiv did not lose its identity. If anything, it deepened it. Every crack in a wall, every broken brick, every bridge still standing told the same truth: that even as the world changes, collapses, and rebuilds, there are places that do not live for power, but for memory. By the 1950s, the hammer and sickle fluttered over the squares. Loudspeakers blared across the boulevards. But inside the small cafes, where old men still told stories of ancient times, people knew the truth. Plovdiv belonged to no regime. It belonged to time itself. And time, like an old and patient God, is always gentle to those who know how to be still. After the war, Plovdiv entered a new kind of era, one without bombs, yet without freedom. In 1946, Bulgaria became the People's Republic, and with it, a red curtain fell over the entire nation. The city that had lived for 8 millennia now had to learn to exist under a new slogan: equality, labor, and progress. But for Plovdiv, a city that had watched too many empires rise and collapse, such slogans were only passing echoes. In the 1950s, concrete began to grow like mushrooms along the Maritsa River. Rows of gray, box-shaped apartment blocks appeared, stamped out as if from the same mold. They crept toward the old neighborhoods, swallowing the yellow of the wood, the green of the shutters, and the scent of sun-dried grapes on tiled roofs. The regime's goal was to build the new man, but Plovdiv was never a place that surrendered easily. Even covered in cement and banners, the city whispered, The old quarters, Nibet Tepe, Kapana, the old town, were branded remnants of the bourgeois past. Many houses were abandoned, others were nationalized. But the people, guided by an instinct passed through generations, did not destroy. They waited. They knew every empire has an expiration date and only memory endures. By day, they worked in textile mills and metal factories, listening to government radio, praising the leader. But at night, behind closed doors, they played old music, told stories of Ottoman times, read Pushkin's poetry, and lit candles before hidden icons of saints. In the 1960s, the state decided to revive culture by turning Plovdiv into the artistic capital of southern Bulgaria. Exhibitions, dance festivals, and propaganda plays filled the theaters. Yet even in those state-approved performances, between the lines of rigid dialogue, the people of Plovdiv managed to slip in something truer. They spoke of earth, river, and hill, old symbols reborn as code words for the soul. Perhaps the strangest thing about that period was how the city existed on two levels at once. On the surface, it was the Plovdiv of industry, factories, bridges, monuments, and slogans. But beneath that surface, there was still the Plovdiv of wind and stone, where archaeologists quietly unearthed the Roman theater, revealing layer after layer of ancient walls. While the system tried to erase religion and history, it was the earth itself that began to bring history back. When the ancient theater was rediscovered in the 1970s, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. People gathered to watch as the white marble seats emerged from the soil, as if the past itself was demanding to be remembered. Officials didn't know what to do: demolish it to build a road, or keep it as cultural property. In the end, they left it standing, and so among the gray buildings a crack in time opened, one that no one could close again. By the 1980s, the system was fracturing. Poets, painters, and musicians in Plovdiv began to quietly revive the old voice. In cafes, they spoke in metaphors, wrote in symbols, painted hills and moons, the language of a freedom once lost. After centuries, the city had returned to its truest nature, to speak through silence. Then came 1989. As the Soviet bloc collapsed, the red curtain fell like a rain of dust. There was no bloody revolution in Plovdiv, only wind moving across the old bridges and people stepping into the streets, smiling at one another. No slogans, no speeches. They simply stood there, listening to the city breathe, free once more. But freedom after revolution is not the same as freedom after empire. It doesn't smell of victory. It carries the scent of uncertainty. When the curtain lifted, people saw the old ruins, the ancient houses, but also their own poverty, their weariness, their confusion about how to live with the present. And so Plovdiv began another familiar cycle, learning to find itself again amid the rubble. Once more, time had to be excavated. Beneath the concrete, beneath the dust of politics, something was still beating, slow, steady, constant, like the heart of a city that never truly dies. When the red curtain finally fell, Plovdiv awoke like someone coming to their senses in a dark room, eyes blinking, unaccustomed to light. The city stood silent, gazing at itself after 40 years, wrapped in concrete and slogans. There were no more flags, no grand monuments, only the ruins, waiting patiently to be heard again. And so the first people began to dig, not for construction, but for memory. In the 1990s, Bulgaria slipped into crisis. Factories closed, the economy crumbled, and the future was uncertain. Yet while the country struggled with the present, Plovdiv found strength in the past. Beneath the earth, archaeologists began uncovering stones, columns, and mosaics, fragments of the Roman theater, Byzantine baths, Ottoman shrines. Each time a shovel struck an ancient rock, it felt as though they had tapped into an underground current of memory, flowing unbroken for 8,000 years. Children came with their parents to watch. The elderly brought chairs to the hills, quietly observing the diggers at work. One old man whispered, "I've heard the voice of this earth since I was a child, and now it's finally speaking again." Beneath the city streets, massive Roman stones emerged, connecting two worlds, the buried past and the fragile present. The feeling was both sacred and practical. Amid economic ruin, the city realized its greatest wealth wasn't money, it was time. But excavation became more than archaeology. It became a collective healing. As people peeled away layers of soil and cement, they were also peeling away the silence that had smothered them for 40 years. Each rediscovered brick wasn't just an artifact. It was proof that we once knew how to build beautifully, think deeply, and live long. Amid hardship, Plovdiv's artists rediscovered their voice. They painted cracked walls, photographed collapsing houses, and held exhibitions among the ruins. No one waited for government approval. They simply created to remember. In Kapana, old workshops turned into galleries, cafes, and studios. Streets, once quiet, now filled with guitar strings, laughter, and footsteps. For the first time in generations, the people of Plovdiv spoke about the future without fear. The city became a perfect metaphor for post-communist Bulgaria, a place both broken and radiant, ancient yet young. On Ottoman walls, modern graffiti bloomed, not to deface, but to converse. One layer of stone, one layer of paint, both telling the same story in different tongues. Existence. And strangely enough, it was during that poorest time that Plovdiv became richest in spirit. Archaeologists spoke of the city beneath the city. Writers called it memory under the skin. But the townspeople said it most simply. Under every step we take, someone once lived and dreamed. At night, streetlights washed over the old walls, illuminating moss and cracks. The city looked as if it were stitching itself back together with threads of light, and in the wind whispering over Nebet Tepe Hill, you could hear something distant, not the voice of the past, but the quiet murmur of continuation. From the earth, Plovdiv had returned, not with noise or triumph, but softly, like the sigh of an ancient soul remembering its name, and this time it would not let itself be buried again. Because now the city understood a simple truth. To unearth a stone is to awaken a piece of the human heart. If one day you walk through the old streets of Plovdiv and stop anywhere, then dig just a few meters down, your hands will touch the stone foundation of another century. And if you keep digging, layer after layer, you'll pass through Rome, Byzantium, Thrace, all the way back to the first people who lit fires by the banks of the Maritsa River 8,000 years ago. Yet perhaps the most miraculous thing is not that history lies beneath the ground, but that history lives within us. Those layers of earth, in a way, are like the layers of the soul. Each generation lays down its own memory, its own wound, its own belief, and then moves on. The city is simply the mirror of that process, a place where the past is never erased, only layered through different ways of living. In a world obsessed with forgetting, Plovdiv stands as proof of the opposite, that we are only truly free when we remember who we once were. When archaeologists shine their flashlights onto ancient foundations, they don't just see stone, they see intention. A single brick tilted at an angle because its builder wanted rainwater to drain faster. A mosaic of a river because someone once loved the Maritsa enough to carve it into their floor. In those details lies an entire philosophy of survival. Not to fight time, but to live with it. To accept that it will cover everything, even us, in dust. Psychologists have said that humans are creatures of memory, but Plovdiv shows that memory isn't only held in the mind, it breathes through earth, stone, and air. People here grow up between ancient walls, hearing footsteps echo on Roman tiles, smelling the damp scent of the past when the rain falls. They don't need books to know history, they breathe it every day. Across millennia, the city has learned never to choose between old and new. It understands that everything is merely a layer upon another. Churches rest on the foundations of temples. Cafes stand above Roman baths. Modern conversations unfold on the very soil once marked by war. Each layer holds its own meaning, each scar its own truth, proof that life has never stopped. When Plovdiv was recognized as one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, the locals didn't throw a grand celebration, they simply smiled, as if someone had finally acknowledged what they'd always known, that the city didn't need a certificate because it's the evidence itself. And perhaps the deeper reflection is this: if the earth can hold its memories in layers of soil, then we can do the same within our hearts. Every experience, every loss, every act of love becomes a thin layer added to the soul. We think we change, but in truth, we are only stacking new versions of ourselves. Maybe that's why Plovdiv brings such calm to those who walk its streets. It doesn't judge, nor does it force you to choose between present and past. It simply invites you to sit, listen to the wind moving through the stone steps, and understand that everything is still continuing. Time doesn't erase, it writes over. And if you learn to read between the lines, you'll see your own story in every speck of dust. At night, when the lights from small cafes cast a soft glow on the ancient walls, the moss shines faintly green, like the veins of the earth. And in that moment, you can feel what the people of Plovdiv often whisper to one another: we don't live on this city, we live within it. And it is in that within and that space where memory and soul intertwine, that the line between people and history, between earth and heart, between past and present disappears. What remains is only continuity, a circle that never closes. When the 21st century began, Plovdiv had no need to chase modernity. It was already modern, not through technology, but through self-awareness. In a world that moves too fast, where cities rise and vanish within a single lifetime, Plovdiv chose the opposite path. It stopped and became a museum of itself, but that doesn't mean it froze behind glass and captions. Plovdiv is a living museum, a place where people still work, sip coffee, fall in love, and argue, all amid Roman ruins, Byzantine churches, and Ottoman mosques. Every corner holds a layer of memory preserved not by fences or barriers, but by the quiet respect of its people for what came before. In the mornings, sunlight spills across the ancient Roman theater where tragedies once echoed 2,000 years ago. Now, laughter of children and the click of tourists' cameras fill the air. At a nearby cafe, old men sit over espresso talking about football, yet sometimes their voices soften when they speak of the buried years. For them, each stone is more than history. It's a witness. The streets winding around Nebetipa Hill now resemble a three-dimensional map of time. Beneath your feet lie Roman pavements. Beside you, Byzantine walls. Ahead, an Orthodox church. And above, the neon sign of a bar. All coexist without conflict, as if in this city, time flows vertically, not horizontally. When Plovdiv was named the European Capital of Culture in 2019, it didn't wrap itself in glitter or glass. It simply opened what was already there. The Bulgarian revival houses were restored by hand, each beam and window frame repainted in the same soft greens and golds of the 19th century. The cracks on the walls weren't erased, only sealed to keep them from spreading, because in Plovdiv, a crack is not a flaw, it's the memory of matter. Visitors are often astonished by how the past and present walk side by side here without colliding. In Kapana, once an Ottoman craft market, the old workshops have become art studios, cafes, and design spaces. On ancient walls, artists paint graffiti. not to cover history, but to speak to it, a modern phrase beside a Byzantine symbol, two heartbeats of the same city. The people of Plovdiv don't treat history as something to be locked in museums. They treat it as something to live with. Children play on Roman steps, couples take wedding photos among ruins, musicians perform concerts inside the ancient theater. Plovdiv doesn't need to recreate the past because it never lost it. And perhaps that's why here, the past does not frighten. In many places, ruins remind people of decay. In Plovdiv, they remind them of continuity. At sunset, when you stand atop the hill and watch the sun turn the old rooftops red and the Maritsa shimmer like a band of glass, you feel that this place isn't old at all. It's simply living at a different rhythm, a slower rhythm, a deeper one, the kind that makes you stop and listen. In that rhythm, Plovdiv feels like an old storyteller, unhurried, unjudging, quietly smiling as the world changes around it. For it has seen all of this before. Empires have come and gone. Religions have risen and faded. Revolutions have changed their flags. All have passed over these hills. Only the city has remained, not to prove anything, but to remind us that memory never dies. It only changes form, from earth to people, from people to words, and then back to earth again. And so, Plovdiv is not merely a museum of itself, it is a museum of humanity, a place where every era still breathes within the same air. At night, warm lights pour through windows, tracing gold over the weathered stone, and the city seems to whisper softly to whoever still listens, I am still here. I still hear. I still remember. A morning in 21st century Plovdiv isn't so different from one 2,000 years ago. The sun still spills over the hills, the Maritsa River still drifts quietly by, and the wind still carries the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. But if you listen closely, you'll hear a new rhythm, the footsteps of the modern age. Trams hum along narrow streets, travelers from every corner of the world lift their cameras, and young artists sit on Roman steps, sketching the city they call the silent teacher of memory. Today, Plovdiv isn't just Europe's oldest living city, it's a city that learns to be reborn every day. After millennia of watching empires rise and fall, Plovdiv has found a new calling, to be a meeting place of time and light, where the past and present don't collide, but illuminate each other. At the heart of the city, Kapana, once an Ottoman craft market, has become an open-air gallery. Murals bloom across old brick walls, cafes spill chairs onto cobblestone sidewalks, musicians strum guitars, students write poetry. Every sound, every color feels like part of a single shared breath, slow, soft, alive. Locals call Kapana the young heart of the old city. And it's true, here Plovdiv isn't just seen, it's felt. Along the Maritsa River, glass-fronted restaurants rise beside Byzantine bridges, reflecting sunset on the water. In summer, jazz echoes through the squares, blending with church bells and the evening call to prayer from Jumiah Mosque, a symphony without a conductor. Plovdiv never tries to make these sounds uniform, it simply lets them coexist. That, perhaps, is what makes Plovdiv unique in the modern age. While the world builds higher, moves faster, reinvents endlessly, Plovdiv stays. It understands that endurance isn't about speed, it's about keeping your soul intact through every change. In a world of cities polished by light and worn by noise, Plovdiv holds something rarer, the beauty of light meeting dust. The light from the street lamps glows upon the dust of centuries, dust no one wants to sweep away, because it proves that beauty can survive even in decay. When night falls, the city turns dreamlike. The orange glow of revival-era houses reflects against the stone. On Nebet Tepe Hill, young people gather with guitars, gazing at the stars, speaking softly of the future. Some call Plovdiv the city of unsleeping souls, not because it's loud, but because here every memory stays awake. What's remarkable is how Plovdiv, even amid tourism, has never become a performance. It lives authentically, unpainted. An old woman still sells flowers by the church. A priest sweeps leaves from the courtyard. An artist sketches in the middle of a crowd. Each person is part of this living museum, not an actor but a witness. In 2019, when Plovdiv became the European capital of culture, there were no fireworks or grand parades. Instead, thousands of people climbed Bunarjik Hill and lit candles together. No speeches, no slogans, only the quiet merging of small flames whispering one truth. We have walked through 8,000 years, and we are still walking. Stand in the main square today, and you can see time itself standing still, or perhaps standing together. A child takes a photo of a Roman ruin with a smartphone. An old man recounts a war story. A young couple kisses beneath an Ottoman arch. All moments coexist, none outshining the other. That is Plovdiv's true essence, a city that lives with time, not against it. Plovdiv doesn't need to become the city of the future. It only needs to remain itself, a city of light and dust, of people and memory. Because perhaps in our restless modern world, few places still teach this lesson, that sometimes to move forward, you need only to sit still, listen to the whisper of stone, and let your heart walk with time, slowly but never stopping. There are cities that live by noise and cities that live by whispers. Plovdiv belongs to the latter. Here, time doesn't flow like a river. It circles slowly, gently, endlessly. Every stone, every stair, every roof carries a faint voice, reminding us that nothing ever truly disappears. It only transforms. At night, walking through the old quarter, you can hear it most clearly, not as sound, but as presence. The wind drifts through the Roman theater, brushes the Byzantine walls, slides over Ottoman domes, and dissolves upon the surface of the Maritsa. In that motion, you can feel 8,000 years breathing together, breaths not separate but continuous, like a story told without end. People often say that everything fades, but Plovdiv doesn't believe that. It proves that time is not the enemy of existence, but its guardian. Every empire that passed through here believed itself immortal, yet all dissolved. Only the city remained because it learned to bow before time, not resist it. If Plovdiv teaches anything to the modern world, it's the art of slowness. In an age where everything is measured by speed, it reminds us that the deepest things happen only when we stop. Like a stone that lies still long enough for moss to grow. Like a river that moves yet never forgets what it carries. Like memory, fading in shape, but never in life. Sometimes, on Plovdiv's hills, people find strange stones, not of archaeological value, but bearing the mark of a human hand. Just a small imprint, perhaps left when someone built a house or prayed. No one knows their name, but the print endures through millennia. And when sunlight touches it, the mark glows like a quiet proof. Time does not erase humanity. It keeps what is pure. Perhaps that's why standing in Plovdiv feels less like arriving and more like returning. Everything is familiar in a way you can't explain. The scent of wood, the sound of stone, the distant rhythm of bells. You're no longer a visitor, but a part of the great continuum. Time here isn't a straight river, but a circle, one that every soul passes through at least once and somehow always finds again. Philosophers once said, memory is the first form of immortality. Plovdiv is that memory, embodied as a city, not glorious like Rome, not sacred like Jerusalem, not dazzling like Paris, but enduring, humble, and real enough to make you believe this might be the place where time pauses to listen to itself. At dusk, When the last sunlight grazes its stone walls, Plovdiv doesn't sleep. It closes its eyes and listens to footsteps echoing on cobblestones, to the quiet murmur of lives passing through. It has witnessed endless change, heard countless promises, confessions, songs, and wars. Yet it still welcomes, still forgives, still opens its heart. For Plovdiv understands, forgiveness is the highest form of memory. This city doesn't ask you to believe in miracles, it is the miracle, a living testament that eternity isn't somewhere distant but right beneath our feet, in the stones, the wind, the simple act of walking. Everything that ever was, still is, and always will be. For there are cities that were born to live, but Plovdiv was born to remember. There are places where time doesn't flow. It sits down. Plovdiv is one of them. After 8,000 years, the city no longer tries to go anywhere. It simply sits in the current of humanity, like a gentle old soul, watching the world change and smiling. Not because it understands everything, but because it knows there's nothing to understand. Things only need to exist, to breathe, and to be remembered. When night falls over the hills, light spills softly from the windows of old houses, small, flickering embers floating in the dark. Nothing grand, nothing glorious, just the quiet rhythm of life, warm and real. In a tiny cafe, an old man tells children stories of the Thracians, of Philip, of the Roman Empire, of Byzantine candles and Ottoman prayers rising in incense smoke. The children listen, wide-eyed, as if the story has no ending, because in truth it doesn't. It's still being told through them. Plovdiv isn't a monument, a destination, or a history lesson. It's a breath, a gentle reminder that time isn't meant to be measured but felt. Here, everything exists simply because it doesn't need to prove itself. The ancient stone doesn't ask for praise, the river doesn't need a name, people don't need to belong in order to remain. Everything simply is, together, as it always was and always will be. If you walk through Plovdiv at dusk, you might see the last rays of sunlight gliding over stone walls, reflecting in the green windows of old revival houses. In that moment, you can no longer tell what year it is, 2025, 1925, or 25 after the birth of Christ, because here, time doesn't separate from people, it touches them, merges with them, and keeps walking by their side. And when the sun finally slips behind Nebet-Tepe Hill, the city grows still again. But it's not the stillness of an ending. It's the stillness of something that continues to live quietly. Plovdiv doesn't need an ending to exist. It only asks to be listened to, not with your ears, but with your heart. Stand in the square and close your eyes, and you might hear what hasn't stopped for 8,000 years. The whisper of stone, the breath of the river, the footsteps of humankind, echoing one after another, forming a circle without beginning or end. There is no before, no after, only presence, fragile but real. And perhaps that's what time has learned here, that not every place must move forward. Some places are born so that time itself may rest. Plovdiv is such a place where time finds its own peace. Thank you for walking with us through the journey of Europe's oldest living city, where every stone still speaks, and every breeze carries the memory of 1,000 generations. This is Lunora, where history sleeps beneath the stars and time itself learns to rest.